Let's talk about the often overlooked, if not forgotten, people who populated the American West. One of the most cherished myths at the heart of the American identity is the pioneer settlement of the West. Brave souls who conquered an uncivilized terrain and expanded America from coast to coast. Described as manifest destiny, that it was God's will for these particular people to take control of nearly the entire continent. And these pioneers are often at the heart of our national identity, capturing the spirit and zeal of the United States as a divine mission. But what if that entire pioneer framework is an ideological fabrication meant to justify the displacement of entire communities, as well as the erasure of the people who already inhabited that area? Megan Kate Nelson, the Pulitzer Prize Award finalist for her previous works on the American West, has a brand new book that directly challenges these assumptions. The Westerners, Myth-Making and Belonging on the American Frontier, just out last month, is a revisionist and character-driven story that tackles many of these central assumptions. The conquering of uncivilized space, the centrality of white actors, the unidirectional march from east to west, and the predetermined conclusion of American supremacy. And yes, the Mormons do make an appearance in this story. So in this video, I want to introduce you to this new book, highlight some of its key arguments and approaches, interview the author, Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, and then offer some of my own thoughts or takeaways on why I believe this book and its stories are crucial, especially for today. Before I dig in, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content that gives some context to our present moment, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday, I connect the past to the present every Wednesday, and I pull back the historian's curtain on Fridays to talk about how history is done, including interviews with authors of new books and articles, like I'm doing today with Megan Kate Nelson and her book, The Westerners. And if you want to give back and support this channel, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, and most important, you know you are supporting public-facing scholarship that aims to bridge the ivory tower and the general world. I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter and following me on different social media platforms where I provide supplemental information and shorter videos and links to various activities going on across the nerd sphere. And please mark your calendars for my next live discussion, which is going to be Wednesday, May 6th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, where I will be discussing Mormon fundamentalism, culminating several Wednesdays where I've been discussing the Trust Me, the False Document documentary on Netflix. But with all that business out of the way, let's get back to the Westerners. Megan Kate Nelson's story begins in 1893 in Chicago at an academic historical conference of all places, where a young historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, delivered a paper that would be probably as influential as any academic historical paper in the United States. Titled The Frontier in American History, he argued that the conquering of the frontier has been the central driving force of creating this American spirit. That idea then becomes mythologized in the American nation. None other than Teddy Roosevelt appreciated and used it as his mantra in American politics. It argues that this white pioneer conquest was part and parcel of what made the United States. But in doing so, it erased lots of peoples and stories that did not fit that simplistic narrative that was created for a particular partisan and political aim. And in The Westerners, Megan Kate Nelson uncovers the histories that were purposely forgotten. The West as an already populated space that intersected with many different communities, that interacted in complicated and evolving ways, and that the triumph of one particular story, this pioneer myth of the white colonizers moving from east to west, meant that was backed by this large-scale capitalism and white supremacy was far from assured, and it meant suppressing these other narratives and stories and people who were moving west to east, north to south, south to north, and building different ideas of what it meant to be living in what white Americans believed to be the frontier. And Megan Kate Nelson does this through several key characters who reflect some of these crucial central stories. Some of these characters are well known, like Sacagawea, whose multicultural and scattered adventures epitomize the era, and whose son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, continued that legacy after Sacagawea's death. Other characters in the book were well known in their day, but mostly forgotten later. People like Jim Beckworth or Little Wolf, who represented the multiracial dimensions of these intersections of the 19th century. And then there are plenty of characters who are probably going to be new to you because they are either rewritten in popular myths or forgotten altogether. People like Maria Gertrudis Barcelo, a Hispana woman who ran successful gambling operations in New Mexico. Polly Bemis, a Chinese immigrant who tried to carve out space for her in an Idaho mining town in the midst of Chinese exclusion and suppression. And Ella Watson, a Canadian woman who tried to make it as a rancher in Wyoming. All of their stories will probably be new to you, but they have broader lessons of the types of communities that existed on the frontier. And while the Mormons don't appear as central players in this narrative, they do appear as side characters, mostly through the experience of Ovando Hollister, a miner-turned-journalist who lived in Salt Lake City for several decades, wrote for the Salt Lake Tribune, and was often a thorn in the side of Mormon leaders. Now, one of my goals on this channel is to both place Mormonism in their broader American context, but also introduce you to important books that you might otherwise miss. This video aims to do both. I hope you'll see through this book why Mormons can be seen differently when placed within this broader stage, as well as reckoning with these larger issues of American history. So that's why I think this book is worth your attention, and why I'm glad to be able to talk with Megan Kate Nelson, the author. Now, I've been very privileged to be friends with Dr. Megan Kate Nelson for a few years, so I'm not going to act like I'm unbiased here. She and I have actually been part of a writing group for a few years as well, so I was fortunate to read some early drafts of this manuscript and see it develop. Now, Dr. Megan Kate Nelson is one of our best storytellers and Western historians practicing the craft of history today. She has authored 5 books, and her book, Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her more recent book, after that one, but before The Westerners, was Saving Yellowstone, Exploration, Preservation, Reconstruction America, which uses the fascinating story of the creation of Yellowstone as a national park to explore these broader issues of federal control and displacement and racial suppression during the Reconstruction era. She's one of the greatest storytellers we have in the historical field. Her books are filled with characters and plot development, short chapters with thrilling tensions that often subvert our general caricatures of the American West. So I hope you enjoy this interview I now have with her that you'll see, where we talk about her new book, The Westerners, the characters involved, especially Ovando Hollister, and what it can tell us about the West and how we remember the West. All right, and I'm very pleased to be joined by the distinguished and award-winning historian, Megan Kate Nelson, who I'm very fortunate to be friends with as well, besides just being a big fan. So congrats, Megan, on the wonderful book. At the heart of your story, though, is you are tackling one of the most central myths in American history and identity, is this idea of the pioneer. And I think everyone can think of these images, whether in text or visual form, of why the pioneers are so important. And you argue in this book that not only is focusing on the pioneer story misleading, but is actually kind of a rewriting of the history. And instead, we need to understand the Westerners. Why is the Westerners a better framework to understand the people who populated the West?
Yeah, well, I think that the term the Westerners is just more capacious. It's more welcoming. When I was kind of going around and talking to people about a previous book, I was thinking about this one and asking people across the West if they thought of themselves as Westerners. And one of my friends, who is biracial, whose father is Black and mother is white, grew up in St. Louis and then also in California and Denver, has lived in the West most of her life. I asked her that question and she said, I never thought that identity belonged to me. And I think that's because the pioneer is a very restrictive image. It's very specific in our collective memory, right? It's the white family from the East coming across in a very linear fashion in a wagon, and then defeating indigenous peoples and the Western wilderness and settling the West for the glory of the country.
Yeah, and so in contesting that myth and creating this capacious understanding of the Westerners, you chose some very compelling characters. So could you talk about why you chose those particular characters and what they represent?
Yeah, it's always a little risky to only choose 7 people and hold them up as representative. There's always going to be a kind of question about, well, are these people just really atypical? Why are we reading about them? And it is true. The 7 people in the Westerners are somewhat atypical in that they often wrote accounts of their own lives, or people wrote about them. And so they entered the record in ways that we can access as historians today, which is itself unusual, especially for the women in the book, of which there are 4 of the 7, which is a great departure from my previous work. And it was super exciting to write about women. But what I think all 7 of these people do is that not only are they there to kind of narrate their own lives, but they're also part of a larger community. And I think this is something also that the Westerners provides, is a sense not only of capaciousness, as I talked about, but also connectivity, that there are other Westerners across the region from multiple different communities, and they are connected to each other through kinship ties, through trade ties, through a kind of sense of themselves and what they are doing in the West. And so these 7 Westerners are also representing a larger community. They are always in community. They are never alone. As the pioneer myth would have it, the pioneers do everything by themselves. They have no help from anyone. And so they are actually representing for me kind of larger movements and larger communities in movement throughout the West.
Yeah, so maybe one example of that, before we get to the Mormon of it all, is you have this character Ella Watson, who is this woman who comes in and is trying to, succeed as a rancher in Wyoming. And then not only does it not go to plan, but even her whole history is rewritten to become what was the nickname that she ends up getting?
Cattle Kate.
Yeah, Cattle Kate. So maybe can you talk briefly about like how that real story is then transformed into myth, which is crucial to, I think, the overall thesis of the book?
Oh, absolutely. This is part of my whole argument about revisionism, that it's actually the pioneer myth and the frontier myth that has revised the reality of American history. Because Ella Watson was a Canadian immigrant. She came with her Scots-Irish Canadian family to Kansas, and ultimately kind of, had a terrible first marriage and left her first husband because he was abusive. Found her way to Wyoming and was trying to build a life for herself as a quote unquote cattle queen, and ran afoul of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And they ultimately punished her in the most final kind of way by lynching her and her kind of partner, Jim Averill. And after they had done that, these stock growers who had control of the local press put out all of these stories that she was in fact Cattle Kate, who is a rather notorious Wyoming woman who was a sex worker, who exchanged cattle for sex and built this reputation. And so Ella Watson, who had nothing to do with Cattle Kate at all, becomes redefined as her because it behooved the Wyoming Stock Growers Association to brand her, so to speak, as a cattle thief, as a sex worker, someone who is not to be taken seriously as a businesswoman.
Yeah, so it's just such a fascinating story. So a lot of my viewers are going to be familiar mostly with the Mormons when they think of the West.
Yes.
And they're largely maybe not as aware of the broader context that's taking place around the Mormons that is often actually shaping their experience. So what I appreciate in your book is not only do the Mormons, have these appearances every once in a while, but they're placed in context of these other groups. For instance, a lot of my viewers probably aren't used to thinking of the Mormons put juxtaposed with the Chinese American experience. But both of them are, facing the brunt of the federal government during the 1880s. So how do the Mormons fit into this broader Westerners narrative?
Yeah, this was a really fascinating part of the history. When I was researching it, I was actually thinking, because Ben, I've known you for a long time through several books, and I was thinking, Ben's going to want me to put in here all the good Mormon history because one of the protagonists of the Westerners is Ovando Hollister, who himself was not Mormon. He actually grew up as a Shaker, but he ended up in Utah and ended up as a vociferous, very active anti-Mormon agitator. And so this was a really good way for me to bring in Mormon history to talk about the ways that people like Ovando Hollister and really largely the Republican Party and the federal government thought of Mormons in Utah as blocking their way. That they were too powerful. They had too much of a stranglehold on the Utah territorial economy and on the population, and that they could never come into the United States unless they gave up particularly polygamy, which was kind of the sticking point. But really, the objection to Brigham Young and to the Mormon Church during this period was not only polygamy, but also their political power. And I thought that was, and their economic power and the extent to which they controlled traffic through Utah, which is right in the heart of the American West, at this point, kind of at the nexus of multiple travel routes, was on the transcontinental line. And so there was a real worry that they were going to have a stranglehold. They could potentially cut off all trade between the East and the West for a certain amount of time. And so I thought that was really fascinating. And I thought it was interesting to consider the Mormons in the kind of same context as Chinese immigrants, and then also as Indigenous Americans, who the federal government perceives in the same kind of way, that they are alien, they are un-American, and they are not fulfilling that kind of frontier pioneer dream. They are not ideal Americans, and they're standing in the way of what America can be in the American West.
Yeah, I think viewers of my channel will be familiar with the political cartoon that I've shown a few times. This political cartoon for the early 1880s of Uncle Sam's troublesome bedfellows that shows Uncle Sam in bed and all the unwanted people in the West, these caricatured versions of Native Americans, Irish Americans, Chinese immigrants, Mormons, and of course, African Americans as these people who don't really belong, with the implication that they should be kicked out. And they all are on the receiving end of federal, instigation, whether it be the Dawes Severalty Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Edmund Tucker Act. Yeah, I think it's so crucial. So also on this topic, I want you to tease my viewers with a bit more of this Ovando Hollister character, because he is just such a fascinating figure.
He really is. So he is the only white guy in the book. Not the only white guy, but the only white guy protagonist of the seven. And he is a little bit of the typical pioneer. He comes from the East, again, grew up as a Shaker, which was super interesting, which I did not know when I first started to research him. I chose him initially because any of your viewers and listeners who study the Civil War in the West will know him because he produced one of the best accounts of the Civil War in New Mexico that we have. He wrote a history of the First Colorado, for which he volunteered. And so I chose him kind of for that purpose. That I knew that he had written this amazing kind of account of the war, and I wanted to depict that conflict from the U.S. side, since I had depicted it from the Confederate side in Three Cornered War. So But I started to research his past. And the fact that he grew up as a Shaker, I think, is super interesting, especially given his anti-Mormonism for the vast majority of his life. He definitely believed that he was kind of anti-religion in many ways, although he did attend church with his wife later in his life. But he really kind of resisted the idea that a central religion, would control all of the aspects of your life, which he definitely experienced as a kid growing up. But he was given a choice when he was a young adult, and he chose to leave the Shakers, and he went to Colorado and was mining for gold when the war began. And then after he was discharged from the Army because he had a medical issue, he became a newspaper editor in the mountains of Colorado. And that's really what led him to Utah. He went as a newspaper correspondent to report on the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And he set up his home base and lived for a while in Corinne. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
As someone whose ancestor lived in Corinne and is in the famous picture of the driving of the Golden Spike, you get brownie points for pronouncing it correctly.
Excellent. Yes. So Hollister had great hopes for Corinne. He thought of it as kind of the Gentile capital of Utah, and he was lobbying for Corinne to be established as the capital and as another kind of nexus where a railroad line would be built north and south so that traders could go into Idaho and Montana. And that failed. And once that failed, he moved to Salt Lake City with his wife, who happened to be the half-sister of Schuyler Colfax, who at the time was the vice president. He was Grant's vice president. And so because of the spoils system, he was appointed a federal tax assessor. So you can imagine the response to his arrival in Salt Lake City. I mean, everybody already knew about him because he had been penning anti-Mormon editorials since 1869. But when he moved in 73 to Salt Lake City, not only was he a representative of the federal government, he was a representative of federal taxation, which no one in the West liked, and Mormons certainly did not enjoy. And then he ended up living literally 3 blocks from Temple Square. And he was running a newspaper, a kind of Gentile newspaper, and politically agitating for the overthrow of Mormon power for, more than 20 years from the Capitol. It's really astounding.
Yeah, it really places not only seeing Mormons within this broader context, but this broader context is home in Temple Square, right? That is actually coming from their midst. By the way, not to get you too upset, but your narrator for the audiobook pronounces Hollister's father-in-law as Schuyler Colfax.
That
was the only mispronunciation I heard in the whole audiobook. But just
did they get Corinne right? Did they get Corinne?
Yeah, they got Corinne right. Yeah, she got Corinne right.
Okay.
So that was good.
We'll excuse that then.
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying this as someone who, the narrator for my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, got every pronunciation right except for Nauvoo. So it's, you win some, you lose some.
How did they pronounce it?
They pronounce it Nauvoo.
Oh, Nauvoo.
So it kind of sounds like the Star Wars Naboo. And also, I think I scared him when I told him that most people mispronounce it in the first syllable by saying Nauvoo. And so he decided, well, I'm just going to skip that syllable altogether. But anyways, so going back to the Westerners, you close the book with a moving epilogue where you say that these stories are not just fascinating for, the minutiae of history, but that these narratives, these myths are created for real reasons that have consequences. So maybe you could summarize this on why do these stories still matter today?
Yeah, they really matter because narratives kind of create nations, right? And these are the stories that we tell about ourselves. And the frontier myth began to emerge from the moment the nation was founded and was very closely tied to all of the other big myths that we hear about and know about: manifest destiny, the American dream, rugged individualism, right? And all of these narratives kind of construct Americans as a people. And when those narratives erase or marginalize or refigure large communities of people, and in this case, in the frontier and the pioneer myths case, all non-white people and many women, then it is saying they are un-American. It is much easier if you are a wholehearted kind of fan of the frontier myth to take people's land away, to take people's rights away, to define them as un-American, as alien, to work to deport them. And I think it's really important. I started this book, during the Biden administration, but I finished it and revised it during the first couple months of Trump 2.0. And already the administration was tweeting out pioneer myth and frontier myth language and imagery. And it just kind of brought home that argument for me that these images still endure, these narratives still endure, and many people in power use them in order to deny other Americans their rights. And that kind of shows you the power of narrative itself, and all of the imagery associated with the pioneer and the frontier myth. I mean, it's super sticky. It's really sticky and very hard to dislodge. And what I hope is that the Westerners kind of gives people not only a sense of the reality of the history of the West itself, but also a way to kind of combat these efforts on the part of the federal government to use that narrative to take people's rights away.
Yeah, very well said. Well, Megan, I really enjoyed the book, and I also enjoyed this conversation. Congrats on such a wonderful work.
Well, thank you so much. And Ben, that because you were part of the process, because if your listeners or viewers don't know, Ben and I are in a writing group. So he read many of the draft chapters for this and was an especially good reader for my Mormon history chapters. So thank you so much for contributing to the book.
You were already prepared because you had to wade through my hefty chapters from American Zion. So it goes both ways.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks again to Dr. Megan Kate Nelson for spending a few minutes with me to talk about her book. Again, while Mormonism does not take a prominent place in this book, and don't worry, I tried to nudge her to include more Mormons in there, but she had enough on her plate to cover. I do think this broader context places the Latter-day Saint tradition and Utah in a broader light, that they weren't living in this vacuum of unsettled space, that they were in a region that was filled with different populations interacting, intersecting, and contesting each other to a great degree. And that the Mormons both built on, but also dissented from this larger pioneer story. They were both proponents of, but they were both opponents of, but beneficiaries of this manifest destiny myth. And as a result, Mormons often fit awkwardly in our narratives of the American West. Jan Ships, the great historian, a few decades ago said that Utah forms this donut hole in the American West, where we have all this history around, but we leave Mormons out, or we just focus on the Mormons without the broader context. Both need each other to get the broad picture. But even setting aside the Mormon connections, The Westerners is worth your time because it raises these important questions that I really think are important to address. As we're thinking about founders this year with the America's semi-quincentennial celebrations of the 250th anniversary, we should consider the political potency of how we think about history. Whose voices are we forgetting? Whose stories are we leaving out? And more importantly, what are the consequences of the triumphant narratives that end up dominating how we view the past? Not just the West, but the United States writ large. This book, The Westerners, doesn't hit you over the head with these questions, but it forces you to think about them nonetheless. Or you can just keep it at a superficial level and enjoy the stories. That would be fully entertaining as it is. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the book too. History has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why I'm so grateful for these books that not only offer us compelling history, but a compelling history that forces us to ask broader questions and reckon with the legacies of those who came before.